What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about how to answer scenario-based questions for the medical school interview. I mentioned in a previous video that for the medical school interviews, you need to know that there are 7 generic question types that may come up, and with each question type there are specific strategies that you need to memorize to structure your questions in a way that would allow you to answer them comprehensively. So this is the first video that I'm releasing. The structure to answer scenario questions is the hardest to practice and it takes the most time to practice. These questions are also not limited to being in MMI interviews. You can also find them in closed and open style interviews because it's fair game whether or not the interviewer would ask you this question. The first step in answering a scenario question is actually identifying a question as a scenario-based question. So here I have a list of different interview questions that may come up, and I'm just going to list out which ones are scenario. You can read it through and just try to rationalize why this is a scenario-based question. Most of the time, it's a question where you have to imagine that you're someone else, like a surgeon or a medical student or a best friend, and there's a particular problem that needs to be resolved. So let's say you are given a scenario-based question. There's 2 main goals that you need to always keep in mind while you're answering a scenario-based question. Number 1 is not to freeze.
Just don't freeze.
I never freeze.
These questions are often the most uncomfortable to answer just because you've never been in those situations before. And sometimes it can seem like it's way out of bounds of what you already know. Like sometimes they can ask you something that usually only medical students would know, but in reality, the thing is they want to see if you can cope with the stress and give a comprehensive answer. This kind of ties in with the second goal. The second goal for scenario-based questions is that they want to see that you're considerate. They want to see that given any situation, you don't jump to the most obvious answer and just give a solution for that. They want you to give multiple perspectives of what could have happened and give solutions for those scenarios. If you don't take anything away from this video, this is the golden structure that I use to never slip up on a scenario question ever in my interview. Actually, by practicing this structure, I would always be able to confidently answer a question during an interview and never leave that interview feeling kind of guilty or feeling bad that I could have said something else. This structure, it kind of ensures that I cover the whole basis and answer that question very well. I'm also going to include it in the description below in case you want to copy and paste it somewhere. And then I'm gonna specifically go over a real life example of a question that an interviewer might ask. Let's say I have this question: what would you do if a surgeon showed up to a case with alcohol in his or her breath? The first thing you would do is number 1, recite the question. Reciting the question ensures that you don't miss any important details of what the question is asking you. And secondly, by reciting the question, it allows you to jog your memory a little and identify with yourself what role do you play in this situation. So in this situation, I would be someone who was in the healthcare team working with a surgeon that has alcohol in his breath. The next thing that you need to do after reciting the question is state the main concern or the primary problem that is presented in this question. So if a surgeon shows up to a case with alcohol in his breath, I would say something around the lines of, my primary concern is the safety and well-being of the patients. You can also add on other concerns such as the health of the physician in relation to possible alcohol use, or you can say something like the effectiveness of the overall healthcare team if the doctor is intoxicated. Something like that. That's your primary concern, and you just need to straight up state that out. It's kind of like your thesis in an essay. You have to state it out just to make it clear to the interviewer that you understand what is going on in the situation. Step number 3 is that you want to show that you don't want to jump to any rash conclusions. You want to see if there's any other way that you can gather information of the case, just to make sure that you don't have a very judgmental approach to that situation. Because if you ask this question, you can judge the surgeon right away. Maybe you can judge the surgeon like, oh, he definitely has alcohol in his system because you can smell it in his breath. But in many cases, the alcohol can be on his shirt or something, you don't know. So step number 3 is you want to explicitly say, I don't want to jump to any conclusions. I would rather gather more information. And the interviewer would also like you to state like, how are you going to gather that information? So just to further gather more information, I would explicitly say something around the lines of, I would continue to observe the surgeon or talk to the surgeon in private in a reserved and respectful way. Again, I don't want to jump to any conclusions. It's kind of helpful sometimes for you to explicitly say in a reserved, in a respectful way, in a non-judgmental way, just to make it clear that you want to not be judgmental in that moment. Then number 4 is the meat of the question where you're going to present the 3 scenarios, which is really important. So you want to break it down into 3. You want to break it down to this. Number 1 is going to be your most benign scenario. You kind of want to imagine like a timeline of 2 extremes and then 1 middle ground scenario. If you think of making your three scenarios an aspect of a timeline, it really helps you out to think of like the two extremes, then finding something in the middle that you can talk about. Because overall, when you're making the three scenarios, the interviewer just wants you to be creative and just voice out what could have happened. So for the most benign scenario, I would probably say straight up that the doctor may have not drank at all. That's the most benign scenario. And then I would support it with like some other commentary. You could be really creative. In this case, I might just think of something like the doctor may have had an emergency and the alcohol that's lingering around their scent may be from helping another intoxicated person and the alcohol may be on them. Not necessarily in their system where they ingested it purposefully. That is like making up that whole scenario. You're building like this whole narrative. And then you always, whenever you build a narrative, you always want to state a solution to it. So this solution is actually really straightforward. I would just say something after that, such as, if this were the case, then the actions that I would take would not be much. It's actually a very straightforward situation and the doctor can continue with his work without much concern. So that's it for the most benign scenario and its solution. The next step is for you to find that middle ground scenario that may have happened. The middle ground, I would say, or make up here is the doctor may have drinking a little before he or she showed up to the shift, and it may cause some impairments to their normal ability to provide patient care. That is like the middle scenario, and I would give a solution. So the solution would be something around the lines of, if the doctor is not able to practice normally and may be in need of some medical help, I would find a way to inform the healthcare team so everyone is aware. This would minimize the potential negative effects the surgeon can have on the patient. We may need to find another surgeon to substitute for the case or may need to reschedule the surgery. So that's the middle ground. By establishing like another story that you can say right here, you can give another elaborate solution that you kind of just have to like think of it in the moment and just state it out. So over here is the most extreme scenario. You can create a story such as the doctor has a history of alcohol use on the job and this is a recurring issue, and that's the story. And your solution is I would contact a higher administration or the department chair or something, and you can also state that it's your duty to help the doctor find resources to manage his alcohol addiction. By contacting the department chair, it would prompt further discussions on how to move forward in ways that keeps patients and the healthcare team safe, whether that means the surgeon will or will not face disciplinary action. These disciplinary actions that you talk about in the most extreme scenario, it can relate to the story where if the doctor did drink a little before on the job as well. After that, you're done. You give out 3 scenarios, 3 stories that may have happened, and then you also gave out 3 solutions to what you would do in those different situations. So you're done with the meat of the answer. I always try to reiterate this. In all of your answers, you want to kind of wrap everything up in about 3 minutes. Because if you talk any further, the interviewer is going to get a little bored. So that's why it's very important to practice this technique very early. That way you can have a flow and be able to state out all the steps like reciting the question, primary concern, gathering information, 3 scenarios very quickly. And then if you do have time and you didn't go over 3 minutes, you can also give a conclusion at the end and give a brief recap on those 3 scenarios, what you would do. So this is how I practice this structure. Here I have some sample questions from this link, BeMo Academic Consulting, and it's number 20 of their list. It's the sample questions. Here is another example. An 18-year-old man is diagnosed with suspected bacterial meningitis. He refuses therapy and returns to the college dormitory. What should a physician do in this situation? Number 1, I would recite the question. Once I answer the interviewer, I would first recite the question. Something around the lines of, in this situation, there is an 18-year-old man who is diagnosed with suspected bacterial meningitis. He refuses therapy, and I am a physician who is in charge of his care at this time. Something like that. Then number 2 is stating your main concern. So your main concern here, I would probably say something around the lines of the health and well-being of not only the 18-year-old man, but also others who may be in contact with him in the dormitory or on campus. Again, there's really no right or wrong way to be imaginative and creative with your answers as long as it's within the ballpark of being right. So here the main concern, I would just say the general well-being and health of both the man and the people that he's in contact with. That should be good enough to state as a main concern. And then number 3, so you want to gather more information. So gathering more information, maybe I can do a diagnostic test, like run some labs, just to make sure that he has bacterial meningitis, right? So diagnostic labs to test meningitis. In this question, he also refuses therapy. So I can ask him, like, have a private conversation on why he is refusing therapy. In this conversation, I can also ask him, like, do you understand the consequences of not receiving treatment, such as giving it to other people, right? Giving it to other people, possibly. And then something else, whenever a patient is refusing or wanting treatment, you can also add something around the lines of, is the patient competent enough to refuse treatment? Sometimes patients can not be truly conscious, meaning that they're very drunk or they have some kind of mental illness that kind of negates their own autonomy, that you have to ask like a family member or someone close of kin to make their medical decisions for. So it's very important, like sometimes when you're gathering information, to ask if the patient is competent enough to refuse treatment or opt in for treatment. So now we're going to number 4, which is giving the 3 scenarios. So the most benign scenario, the in-between scenario, the most extreme. The most benign thing that may happen is if you run the diagnostic labs and it shows that he does not have the disease. So the solution to if he does not have the disease is you can just basically say, this is actually a straightforward scenario and I would not report any actions to be done to the college authorities. That's the easiest story and solution that may come up. So for the middle ground scenario or story that you can make up, you could say something around the lines of, the patient is confirmed to be diagnosed with meningitis after testing, and he is still refusing therapy. However, if he is able to compromise and being willing to quarantine while still living on campus, then he can continue with his education at the university. That's something that you can come up as a solution for. Like if he is willing to quarantine, then he can continue. And it kind of gives you an idea for the most extreme scenario, which may be that the patient is confirmed with the disease, he is refusing therapy, and he is not willing to compromise by quarantining and keeping himself away from other people on campus. And because he is a threat to the livelihood of other people on campus, then you can suggest a solution such as using disciplinary action to force him to not be on campus while having the disease. And that can be your solution for that one. To make your solution not sound so harsh, you can also say, while we are using disciplinary action to keep him away on campus, we're still giving him some resources to still access healthcare and give him adequate healthcare prior to accepting him on campus again. So those are the 3 scenarios. It can be a stretch, but the more that you practice imagining what would be the most benign scenario and what would be the most extreme scenario, it usually helps you think of the middle ground as well. And for number 5, I would just state a conclusions. I would just give out a brief summary of what the 3 scenarios are and the solutions for them. So yeah, that's it. How to answer scenario-based questions. The most important thing is you have to practice brainstorming of 3 scenarios, and it will help you give a really comprehensive answer. The way I practiced was by having a list of these questions and writing down all 5 steps of how I would answer the question, just like how I did right here with the Google Doc. After practicing for about a month, I was able to have a flow and be able to think of the 3 scenarios without writing it down. And that's actually how you get better at practicing these scenario questions. You just have to write it out until it's easy enough for you to just think about it without writing it down. One last important point is that when I was preparing for these scenario-based questions or MMI questions in general, I found it really helpful to read out the sample questions that are in the BeMo MMI interview book. What I like about that book is it gives you questions that could be pretty long, and it gives you very, very comprehensive and expert answers from people who have been on admissions committees before. So I think in the book it has about 15 or 16 example scenario questions. No matter where I was in my interview journey, I would always come back to reading those 15 or 16 questions and answers right before a real interview, because it's such a good refresher. Before, like 2 days before your real interview, just read all the sample questions and answers, and you'll be really solid with the scenario questions, the policy questions, the personal questions. I also recommend getting it really early. That way it can also influence how you plan out answering a lot of the questions for your interviews. So yeah, if you have any other questions, just post down in the comment section below. And if you would like, subscribe. It will help me a lot. Thank you for watching.